In a low factory building in Brantford, Ontario, workers are still feeding lengths of lumber into machines that shape, sand, and paint them into one of the last wooden hockey sticks made in the country that invented the sport. It is, according to Newsweek, Canada's last major wooden hockey stick factory, producing around 400,000 sticks a year, with roughly 100,000 of them bound for the United States. As of this week, that small factory in Ottawa's neighboring province sits at the exact center of a trade fight that has pulled in wine growers in the Okanagan Valley, cement plants in Quebec, dairy farmers on the prairies, and the highest levels of government in both Washington and Ottawa. This is the story of how a 50% tariff on hockey sticks, wine, and cement became one of the most serious tests yet of the relationship between the United States and Canada, and where things actually stand right now, with the clock running out before a deadline that arrives in less than 48 hours. To understand how the two countries got here, you have to go back to July 20th. That is the day President Donald Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking a section of American trade law that had been sitting unused for nearly a century. According to the White House's own fact sheet, each Section 338 proclamation imposes a 50% tariff on a different set of Canadian imports, and together they cover products ranging from wine to hockey sticks to cement. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 gives a president the authority to impose duties of up to 50% on goods from a country found to be discriminating against American commerce. A senior administration official told reporters, as reported by outlets including the Cascadia Daily News and the Montrose Press, that to their knowledge, Section 338 had never been used for this purpose before. It is, in other words, a legal tool built during the Great Depression, revived almost a century later, and aimed squarely at America's closest neighbor. The list of targeted goods is far broader than the headline items suggest. According to a trade compliance tracker, tariffstool.com, the new duties are split across 3 separate proclamations covering dairy products like milk, cream, and whey, a category oddly labeled motor vehicles that, despite the name, contains no cars at all, but instead electronics, telecom equipment, furniture, home goods, building materials such as lumber, plywood, doors, and cement, plastics, packaging, clothing, footwear, luggage, toys, sporting goods, machinery, cosmetics, and agricultural products like flowers and seeds. In total, the tariffs touch well over a dozen distinct Canadian industries. The White House fact sheet confirms that energy products, potash, fish, and critical minerals are exempted, along with goods already covered under separate Section 232 tariffs. But almost everything else Canada ships south now falls under this new 50% rate. Here's where the story gets more complicated, and where it becomes clear this is not a simple tariff hike. According to the trade analysis from tariffstool.com, these Section 338 tariffs apply to covered goods, regardless of whether they qualify for preferential treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as USMCA or CUSMA, depending on which side of the border you're on. Under most of the tariff regimes Trump has used over the past 2 years, USMCA-compliant Canadian goods were shielded or given favorable treatment. Section 338 was built differently. It targets specific goods as a direct retaliatory response to specific Canadian policies, and a valid USMCA certificate of origin does not exempt a covered product from it. For Canadian exporters who spent years building supply chains around USMCA compliance, that detail alone has been described by trade lawyers as the part importers are most likely to miss, and the part most likely to cost them. So why did the administration choose these particular products, and why now? According to Al Jazeera's reporting from the day the tariffs were announced, the White House framed the move as a response to what it called discriminatory treatment by Ottawa against American alcohol, automobile, and dairy products. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer put it directly in a statement carried by Al Jazeera, arguing that Canada had taken American alcohol products off Canadian shelves, given the European Union better market access for dairy products than the United States receives, and kept American vehicle exports to Canada from companies reshoring production to the U.S. The administration also noted, according to Al Jazeera, that Canada was the only country besides China to retaliate against Trump's earlier tariffs last year, a framing the White House used to justify singling Canada out. Canada's side of that story looks different, and it matters for understanding what happens next. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney responded within a day of the announcement, according to CBS News, arguing that Canada's trade actions against the United States last year, including its own auto tariffs, had merely matched tariffs the Trump administration imposed first. Tariffs, Carney said, violated the USMCA agreement in the first place. Carney's statement, as quoted by CBS News, warned that the ongoing trade dispute has raised costs for families, particularly in the United States, and said Canada stands ready to engage intensively to resolve outstanding issues to the mutual benefit of citizens on both sides. It's a familiar pattern in this dispute. Each government insists its own measures are defensive, a response to something the other side did first, which is part of why untangling who escalated first has become almost impossible. There's also a second, murkier thread running alongside the tariff announcement, and the administration has gone out of its way to separate it from the main story. Just days before the July 20th tariffs were signed, wildfire smoke from fires burning in Ontario blanketed much of the northeastern United States and drifted down the east coast. President Trump, according to reporting picked up by the Cascadia Daily News and Kiowa County Press, had threatened over that same weekend to demand compensation from Canada over the smoke, warning that tariffs could follow if Canada didn't pay up. But when the Section 338 tariffs were formally announced, a senior administration official was explicit on a call with reporters. These are not the so-called wildfire tariffs, the official said, adding that the president had asked for options on the wildfire issue separately, and that those options were still being developed. Whether a wildfire-related tariff or compensation demand ever materializes remains, as of today, an open and unconfirmed question, not a fact. The timing of the announcement carries its own irony. According to the Ynet News report on the tariffs, Trump did not mention the planned tariffs during a private conversation with Carney just one day earlier when the two leaders appeared together at the 2026 World Cup final trophy ceremony in East Rutherford, New Jersey. An administration official told reporters that although the president and prime minister met privately that day, the conversation was not, from the American side, intended to focus on trade or tariffs at all. Less than 24 hours later, the tariff proclamations landed. It's the kind of detail that captures how this relationship has functioned over the past year. Cordial in public, strained underneath, with major economic decisions, arriving with little warning even after face-to-face meetings between the two leaders. To understand why the administration reached for an obscure 1930s law in the first place, you need the legal backstory, and it goes back to earlier this year. According to reporting from the news, from the state's outlet, Trump's earlier and much broader tariffs on global trading partners, including Canada, had been imposed in April of 2025 under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law originally passed in 1977. Those tariffs were challenged in court, and in February of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled them illegal. The U.S. Court of International Trade subsequently ordered the administration to refund roughly $166 billion in duties that importers had already paid under that invalidated tariff regime. Almost immediately after that ruling, the administration pivoted to other legal tools. First, a temporary 10% base tariff on all imports under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, and eventually to Section 338, the tool now being used against Canada specifically. In other words, this isn't the administration's first attempt at broad tariff authority. It's what came after the court struck the first attempt down. Even before the July 20th announcement, Canada was already absorbing a stack of American tariffs that had accumulated over roughly 18 months. According to Ynet News, existing U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods at the time included 25% duties on steel and aluminum, 35% on softwood lumber, 10% on certain energy products, 5% tied to forced labor import restrictions, and 25% on vehicles not manufactured in the United States. On its side, Canada had already imposed a 25% tariff on fully assembled vehicles imported from the U.S., along with duties on alcoholic beverages and dairy products above certain import thresholds. So when people describe this as an escalation, they mean it literally. This is layer upon layer of tariffs stacked on an already tense trading relationship, not a single opening shot in a new conflict. It's worth remembering that Canada's countermeasures against the United States didn't start this year either. According to Canada's own Department of Finance, back on March 4th, 2025, then Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc and then Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly announced Canada's first major retaliatory package, 25% tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods immediately, including orange juice, peanut butter, wine, spirits, beer, coffee, appliances, apparel, footwear, motorcycles, cosmetics, and paper products, with the explicit threat to expand that to $155 billion in goods if the U. Hess tariffs continued. That first list gives you a sense of scale for what a full-blown Canadian response can look like when Ottawa decides to go big. It is also the scale Canadian officials keep referencing when they talk about what could come next if the current dispute isn't resolved. Notably, though, Canada had already been walking some of those measures back before this latest round of American tariffs hit. According to Canada's official government website on its response to U.S. tariffs, in recognition of the fact that most Canadian goods were entering the United States tariff-free under COSMA, Canada removed its counter tariffs on most U. Hess imports effective September 1st, 2025. The government kept its counter tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles in place, specifically because the United States had not extended COSMA exemptions to those sectors. So heading into this summer, the trade relationship wasn't at its most hostile point. It was, relatively speaking, cooling down. The July 20th announcement of 50% Section 338 tariffs reversed that trajectory almost overnight. Now to the actual deadline, because this is where the story becomes urgent rather than historical. The Section 338 tariffs are set to take effect 30 days after signing, which multiple outlets, including CBS News and the CFIB, confirm lands on August 19th, 2026 at 12:01 a.m. That is not a hypothetical future date. As of the moment this is being recorded, that deadline is less than 2 days away. According to the Washington Post's reporting from August 15th, the United States and Canada are, in the newspaper's words, inching closer to a deal to avert the imposition of these punitive tariffs based on conversations with industry executives and trade specialists following the latest round of talks. The Washington Post describes the dispute as the latest exchange in a relationship that has disrupted what used to be, as the paper put it, an once harmonious partnership over the past year. So what has Canada actually done in response right now, today? This is the part of the story that requires the most care, because a lot of headlines compress it into something more dramatic than what has actually happened. Canada has not announced a formal itemized retaliation list the way it did back in March of 2025. What Canada has done is signal, repeatedly and at multiple levels of government, that retaliation remains fully on the table if a deal isn't reached before the deadline hits. According to a Reuters-sourced report following a meeting of Canada's premiers in Charlottetown, Prime Minister Mark Carney said that everything's on the table if there's no agreement, deliberately broad language that Ottawa has so far declined to narrow into a specific product list. Carney has also made clear, according to that same reporting, that Canada will not retaliate before the American tariffs actually take effect, a sequencing choice that keeps Ottawa's options open without triggering an immediate tit-for-tat before the deadline arrives. Provincial leaders have been less restrained in their public language, even while the federal government keeps its cards close. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, according to a report compiled from Canadian coverage of the dispute, has warned that if the tariffs proceed as scheduled, Canada should respond tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar, explicitly raising the possibility of a fresh round of retaliatory measures on the same rough scale as the $30 billion package Canada imposed back in 2025. Ford has been one of the loudest provincial voices in this fight since it began, consistently positioning himself as an advocate for a harder line than some in Ottawa are willing to take publicly, at least so far. On the American side, the message from trade officials has been just as pointed and just as public. According to Bloomberg's reporting from August 14th, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, speaking to reporters at the Iowa State Fair, said Canada needs to scrap its retaliatory trade measures against U.S. products in order to avoid the new tariffs taking effect the following week. Greer specifically emphasized, according to Bloomberg, that the United States wants Canadian provinces to reverse their bans on American alcohol sales, bans that were put in place last year after Trump's initial round of tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos. Greer also pointed to Canadian protectionism on dairy and government procurement rules as issues that need to be resolved. Any potential resolution, Greer said, according to Bloomberg's reporting, has to include all of these issues, or at minimum a credible pathway toward addressing them. That demand sets up the actual shape of the negotiation happening right now in the final hours before the deadline. According to a report from the outlet QZ.com covering trade talks from August 12th, Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met with Greer in Washington that Tuesday, the third such meeting between the two sides in as many weeks. LeBlanc, joined by Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette, wrote afterward that Canada remains committed at the negotiating table and continues to work diligently to advance and defend Canadian interests. According to that same report, Canadian and American trade representatives were aiming to present a framework for a deal to President Trump before the deadline, with the negotiating agenda reportedly including the elimination of Canada's retaliatory auto tariffs, the lifting of provincial restrictions on American alcohol sales, and a reworking of the dairy quota structure that has been a persistent irritant on the American side for years. Those talks have continued right up through this weekend. According to CP24's reporting, updated as recently as this morning, LeBlanc and Charette spent the weekend in Washington after meetings the previous week, and on Sunday held a 1-hour virtual meeting involving LeBlanc, Greer, and Charette together. A spokesperson for LeBlanc described that session as constructive, according to CP24, saying the three had taken stock of the work done by their respective negotiating teams and that discussions are continuing. That is, as of this recording, the most recent confirmed development in the negotiation, a Sunday evening virtual call described in cautiously positive terms, with no announced breakthrough and no confirmed deal, happening roughly 48 hours before the tariffs are set to take legal effect. It's worth pausing here to underline just how much economic weight is riding on whether these talks succeed in the next 2 days. According to Canada's own government website on its tariff response, the United States and Canada are each other's largest trading partners. with $2.5 billion worth of goods and services crossing the border every single day. According to figures from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, cited by When It News, the American goods trade deficit with Canada stood at $46.4 billion in 2025. That deficit is part of the economic case the administration has used to justify a harder line on trade with Ottawa, even though economists broadly note that trade deficits alone don't necessarily indicate unfair trading practices. They simply reflect the flow of goods between two economies with very different sizes and specializations. Back to that hockey stick factory in Ontario for a moment, because the story around it captures something the broader tariff numbers can't. Newsweek's reporting on Rouston Hockey in Brantford points out an irony at the heart of the tariff list. The wooden sticks that plant produces, the genuinely Canadian-made product, represent a shrinking slice of what people actually buy today. Modern professional and consumer hockey sticks are overwhelmingly carbon composite, built through international supply chains centered largely in China, not through Canadian lumber mills. Newsweek's analysis suggests the tariff aimed at what the administration clearly intended as a symbolically Canadian product may end up sparing most of what Americans actually think of as a Canadian hockey stick, while landing hardest on the one small factory still making the traditional wood-shafted version. One line from that coverage sums it up well. This is less trade war than a slapshot returning toward the shooter. The wine industry has been vocal too, on the American side of the border. According to CBS News, the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, a trade group representing American producers of whiskey, vodka, and other spirits, issued a statement the day the tariffs were announced, warning that the 50% tariff deepens trade tensions and raises the risk of further retaliation. That reaction matters because it's a reminder that these tariffs don't only threaten Canadian exporters. American industries that depend on cross-border trade, including alcohol producers who could face Canadian retaliation of their own, have skin in this game as well, and they've said so publicly. There's also a wider legal and structural backdrop worth understanding, because this dispute isn't happening in isolation from the broader USMCA relationship. According to a timeline compiled by the law firm Blake's, the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement underwent its first 6-year joint review this year, as required under the agreement's own terms, and the July 1st, 2026 deadline for the U.S. to agree to extend the deal for another 16-year term passed without that agreement being reached. That detail matters because it puts the current tariff fight inside a larger, slower-moving question about whether the entire USMCA framework, the trade architecture underpinning nearly all of North American commerce, gets renewed on its original terms, renegotiated, or allowed to lapse into a more uncertain status. The Section 338 tariffs, in that sense, are one visible flashpoint inside a much bigger and less resolved structural negotiation. So where does that leave things right now, as close as this recording can get to real time? The honest answer is unresolved and moving fast. The 50% tariffs on Canadian wine, hockey sticks, cement, dairy, and the dozen-plus other product categories covered by the 3 Section 338 proclamations remain legally scheduled to take effect at 12:01 a.m. on August 19, 2026. Canada has not announced a formal, itemized retaliation package the way it did in March of 2025, but Prime Minister Carney has said everything is on the table. Provincial leaders, including Doug Ford, are pushing for a dollar-for-dollar response, and Canada's negotiating team spent the weekend in Washington, in talks described as constructive but without a confirmed resolution. The Washington Post reports the two sides are inching closer to a deal. Whether inching closer becomes an actual agreement before the deadline, or whether the tariffs take effect as scheduled and Canada then responds with its own countermeasures, is a question that literally cannot be answered with certainty from where we're standing today. Anyone telling you they know for sure which way this breaks in the next 2 days is going further than the evidence currently supports. It's also worth understanding just how far provincial retaliation has already reached, because this isn't only a federal government story playing out between Ottawa and Washington. According to a tracker maintained by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, provinces have taken their own measures independent of whatever the federal government eventually decides. Nova Scotia removed all alcohol from the United States from the shelves of the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation, effective back on February 4th. The Northwest Territories halted its own Liquor and Cannabis Commission's purchases of American goods around the same time. Nova Scotia also doubled the cost of Quebequid pass tolls for commercial vehicles coming from the United States. Several provinces have been reviewing their government procurement policies specifically to reduce or eliminate purchases from American companies where alternatives exist, and some jurisdictions have set aside contingency funding, with Nova Scotia's 2025 to 2026 budget alone earmarking $200 million to help the province manage the broader economic fallout from the tariff dispute. None of that provincial-level activity is new as of this week, but it forms the backdrop the Trump administration is pointing to when it accuses Canada of discriminatory treatment, since much of what USTR Greer describes as retaliatory measures lives at exactly this provincial level. Not in a single federal policy Ottawa could simply reverse with one announcement. That provincial layer is also part of why this negotiation is more complicated than a normal two-country trade talk. Canada's federal government does not have direct authority to force a province like Nova Scotia or Ontario to restock American alcohol on liquor store shelves, since alcohol distribution in Canada is constitutionally a provincial responsibility, not a federal one. When Greer says, as reported by Bloomberg and Canadian Mortgage Trends, that Canada needs its provinces to reverse their bans on American alcohol sales, he's effectively asking Ottawa to coordinate across 10 separate provincial governments and 3 territories, several of which have their own political incentives to keep a hard line against Washington, particularly with Ontario's Doug Ford positioning himself as one of the most vocal advocates for continued pressure. That federal-provincial dynamic is one of the less discussed but genuinely significant obstacles standing between where the talks are right now and an actual signed agreement. There's a broader pattern in how the Trump administration has approached tariff authority since the Supreme Court ruling in February, and it helps explain why Section 338 specifically was the tool chosen for Canada. According to the timeline compiled by the law firm Blake's on top of the Section 338 proclamations, the Office of the United States Trade Representative separately finalized an investigation in the summer into 60 foreign economies, including Canada, over forced labor practices in supply chains. That investigation concluded that countries failing to adopt or enforce prohibitions on imports made with forced labor would face a 5% tariff, while those that had adopted such prohibitions but weren't enforcing them effectively would face a 10% tariff effective July 24th, with CUSMA-compliant Canadian products exempted from that particular measure. It's a reminder that the Section 338 tariffs on wine, hockey sticks, and cement didn't arrive in a vacuum. They landed on top of an administration that has spent the months since its broader tariff authority was struck down, building a patchwork of narrower, more legally specific tariff tools, each aimed at a different justification, and each requiring its own legal and diplomatic response from Ottawa. There's some relief buried in the fine print too, which is worth mentioning for balance. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business Tracker, alongside the new 50% tariffs taking effect August 19th, tariffs on certain steel and aluminum derivative products are actually set to drop from 25% down to 15%, covering specific downstream manufactured goods rather than raw steel and aluminum themselves. It's a small carve-out inside an otherwise escalating dispute, and it suggests the administration is willing to adjust individual tariff lines even while holding a hard line on the broader Section 338 package, which may be one reason Canadian negotiators still see room for a deal rather than treating the relationship as a lost cause. Zoom out one more level, and the Canada dispute looks even more significant because it's not the only major trade fight Ottawa has been managing over the past 2 years. Canada spent more than a year in a separate trade dispute with China, beginning in October of 2024 over what Ottawa described as anti-competitive practices and market distortion tied to Chinese government subsidies, particularly around electric vehicles. According to a summary of that dispute, Prime Minister Carney traveled to Beijing in January of this year and announced a preliminary agreement in which Canada would significantly reduce its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for China lowering tariffs on Canadian canola oil and suspending tariffs on other Canadian agricultural exports, though Canadian tariffs on Chinese steel remained in place even after that deal. The point isn't that the China dispute and the American dispute are connected in any direct legal sense. It's that Carney's government has now negotiated its way through one major trade confrontation with China in the same period. It's trying to manage this one with the United States, which gives some indication of how this government tends to approach these standoffs. Hold firm publicly, keep channels open privately, and look for a negotiated landing rather than a prolonged standoff, right up until a firm deadline forces a decision. None of that history guarantees a similar outcome this time. Trump's relationship with Canada carries its own particular edge that the China dispute didn't have. According to WeNet News, Trump has long viewed Canada as an economic rival and has frequently joked about making it the 51st American state, a comment that Canadian officials and much of the Canadian public have not taken as a joke, particularly amid an active tariff dispute. That framing matters for understanding the political stakes on Carney's side. A trade deal that looks, to Canadian voters, like it capitulates too easily to American pressure carries real domestic political risk for a prime minister who has spent much of the past year positioning himself as someone willing to stand up to Washington when necessary, which is part of why the everything's on the table language out of the Charlottetown Premier's meeting was deliberately left broad rather than narrowed into specific commitments this early. There are a few things worth naming clearly before wrapping up, because transparency about what's confirmed and what isn't matters more than usual on a story moving this fast. The facts about the July 20th tariff proclamations, the product lists, the August 19th effective date, And the exemptions for energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals come from the White House's own fact sheet and are corroborated across Al Jazeera, CBS News, and multiple wire service source local outlets. The legal background on Section 338 and the earlier IEEPA tariffs being struck down by the Supreme Court is confirmed by court records referenced in reporting from news from the states. The negotiation details, including the LeBlanc-Greer meetings, Greer's Iowa State Fair comments, and the Sunday virtual call, come from Bloomberg, QZ.com, and CP24, all of which name their sources directly. What remains unconfirmed and should be treated as such is any specific Canadian retaliation list, the outcome of the current negotiations, and whether a separate wildfire-related tariff or compensation demand will materialize, since administration officials have explicitly said that issue is still under review and separate from the Section 338 action. Anything beyond those confirmed points at this stage is speculation, not reporting. It's also worth flagging that some of the framing floating around online treats Canada's response as though a formal countermeasure package has already been unveiled. Based on everything gathered here, that has not happened as of this recording. What has happened is a set of public statements, provincial measures that predate this specific tariff round, and an active, still unresolved negotiation. Framing that overstates Ottawa's position beyond what officials have actually confirmed, isn't supported by the sourcing above, and it's worth treating with skepticism if you see it elsewhere. What's clear is that this dispute has moved well past symbolism. It started in the public imagination as a story about hockey sticks and wine bottles, products chosen partly because they carry cultural weight on both sides of the border. But underneath that framing sits a genuinely consequential fight over dairy quotas, alcohol distribution rules in Canadian provinces, vehicle export caps, and the future shape of the USMCA agreement that both economies depend on. $2.5 billion in goods and services cross that border every day. A $46 billion trade imbalance sits at the center of the American argument. A $155 billion retaliation threshold sits in Canada's back pocket from the last time this happened. And a factory in Brantford making 400,000 wooden hockey sticks a year, mostly by hand, is caught in the middle of a fight over trade law that has almost nothing to do with hockey at all. Given everything laid out here, the real question worth sitting with is this: does a deal actually get reached before that midnight deadline on August 19th? Or does this become the moment the trade relationship between the United States and Canada takes its most serious hit in years, with Ottawa forced to respond in kind? What do you think happens in the next 48 hours? And if you were sitting in Carney's chair right now, would you hold the line on retaliation? Or would you rather see Canada cut a deal, even if it means giving ground on the dairy and alcohol rules the U.S. is demanding change on? Let me know where you land on that. That's where things stand for now, and as this story develops over the next 2 days, it's worth keeping an eye on it, because whichever way it breaks is going to shape how these two countries trade with each other for years to come. Thanks for watching.